it's Mrs. Bokerman. This video is going to teach you how to solve quadratic equations by graphing them. So we've talked a little bit about different ways to solve them. The first way that you could solve a quadratic is if you did the factoring. So if you factored it and then used the zero product property. The second thing you could do is use the quadratic formula, and that works 100% of the time, although it does take a little bit longer. The third thing that you could do is you could actually graph it, and then your answers are the x-intercepts where it crosses the x-axis, because that's when the y value would actually be 0. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so just kind of a quick review. If you solve by factoring, here's a picture with the same quadratic, x squared plus 12x plus 32. So here's this side looks like how you would factor it. You think of how do I get x squared, that's x and x, and you think how do I get 32, and there's 3 different options, 1 and 32, 2 and 16, and 4 and 8, but then you got to try to get 12. And so what works is you got 4 and 8, and then when you set them both equal to 0, you get -4 and -8. Well, these answers are actually the roots. They are the x-intercepts. They are the solutions. And notice you get the same thing whether you do the quadratic formula. So it really doesn't matter. When it says solve, you could try to factor it. You could do the quadratic formula, or you could graph it. You would get the same answer regardless. The answer to this quadratic is -4 and -8. And so if you look at the graph, that's exactly where it crosses the x-axis. Okay, so we're going to talk about the steps to graphing. So let's graph this quadratic. We have 2x squared plus 4x minus 6. Now, if you think back to when we did vertex form, what we did is we found the vertex, put it in the middle of our table, we picked points around it, and then we got those points from our graphing calculator, and then we just plotted them. Well, that's great, except for this is a quadratic that's in standard form, and so these numbers 2, 4, and -6 don't represent the vertex, okay? So the first thing that we have to find, we're going to follow those same steps, but the first thing that we have to find is actually our vertex. So if we're going to graph, what we're going to do is we're going to find the vertex by taking the opposite of b and dividing by 2 times a. Okay, and that kind of part is also seen in the quadratic formula. So we're just going to do the opposite of b divided by 2 times a. Now, what I want to point out is the fact that when you find this vertex, you're only finding the x value. You still don't know the y value, so you still don't know the vertex totally. Okay, but once you find that number, you can put that number in the middle of your table and pick 2 numbers above it and 2 numbers below it. Okay, then we're going to find our y values by using our graphing calculators, or if you don't have a graphing calculator, you're going to plug it in the long way. Okay, and I'll show you that in a second. So if I were to do opposite of b over 2a, I would take b, which is the 4 in the middle, so that's -4 because this is a positive, so opposite, divided by 2 times a. In this case, a is 2. So the first thing is I'm going to figure out what the bottom is. So 2 times 2 is 4. And then I'm going to divide the top by the bottom, and I get -1. This is what's going to go into the middle of our table, okay? So if I put -1 right in the middle, I'm going to pick 2 numbers on either side. So on the left side, I would go farther negative, -2, -3, and then if I was counting up, I would have 0 and then 1, okay? So I have to first find the vertex by using this formula. It's something that you have to memorize, opposite of b over 2a. But again, that only gives me the x value. Okay, so I have to get all these y values. So I'm going to kind of review with you how to do this. If you have a graphing calculator, then you're going to click on the y equals button. You're going to type in, and then you hit second graph, which brings up the table. And remember, you can scroll, and it'll give you all the y values. If you don't have a graphing calculator, I kind of gave you some steps. Here's this quadratic. We need to plug them in. So these are the x's. We would plug them in. So if I were to plug in -1, which is the vertex, notice how I have parentheses around every time I'm plugging it in to the x spot, which shows up here and here. Okay, and remember that if you're plugging it in, you don't actually have to plug in all 5 because these should match, the first one and the last one and the ones around it. That's why there's that symmetry. Okay, so either way, you get these answers, and now you can make your table. So now I have my table of values. Okay, so here in the middle, this is my vertex, -1, -8. After you find the vertex, make your table, now it's just a matter of plotting points. So I'm going to plot the point -3, 0, 1, 2, 3. I'm going to put a dot. I'm going to plot the point -2, -6. I'm going to plot the point -1, -8, 0, -6, and 1, 0. And I'm going to attempt to connect them. And here is my quadratic. Okay, so that is the graph, but you're actually supposed to solve. So they want to know what the x-intercepts are. These are the solutions. Okay, the solutions are your x-intercepts. So what solutions do we have? Where does it cross the x-axis? At 2 points. You can tell that it's here and here. You can also tell quickly from your table it's where the y value is 0. So one of your answers is -3, 0, -3. And the other answer is 1, 0. So that's where it crosses the x-axis. If we were to ever ask you for the y-intercept, remember the y-intercept is when the other one is 0, when x is 0. So you can tell from your table, or you could tell right there. So in this case, the y-intercept would be 0, -6. And that's it. It's very similar to when we did it in vertex form. The just hardest part is you don't have the vertex. So let's try another one. Okay, I picked this one because notice there's not 3 things. Okay, so when there's not 3 things, you have to be very careful because you need to figure out, are you missing the b or are you missing the c? So remember, it goes x squared, that's the a, x is, that's the b, and then c is any number. So I have an a and a b. This is the case where I'm missing c. So I'm going to do opposite of b over 2a. So if I have -9, the opposite is positive, and then 2 times a, that's -3. Okay, so then I'm going to multiply the bottom. I get -6. So I have, if I divide these on my calculator, I get -1.5. That is my vertex, so I'm going to put that in the middle. Okay, now I don't really want to count by halves. So what I'm going to do is, if I'm at 1.5, what's in the middle of -1.5? It's in between -1 and -2. So I don't want to count by fives because my graphing calculator isn't going to allow me to do that. So that would be a lot of plugging it in. Okay. So I'm going to leave that for right now. Now, one of the things I want you to know is then you would go ahead and go to y equals, and you would type this in, and then you would go to second graph again and look at the table. One of the things I want to point out is if you'll see 1.5 actually does not show up. Okay. Remember, we said it was in the middle of -1 and 2. And notice here's your symmetry, 6, 6, 0, 0, right? Okay. So if that's the case, all right, I can fill in this table. -3 is at 0, -2 is at 6, -1 is at 6, and 0 is at 0. That's great, but you're missing that 1.5 because your table is not set up to go by halves. It's set up to go by ones. So all you have to do is just do it the long way. Okay, you have to plug it in by hand. So just like everyone else who doesn't have a graphing calculator, you're going to plug it in everywhere you see an X. So it would look like this. You would take -3 on your calculator times -1.5 -9 times -1.5. Don't forget to square it. And if you type it in on your calculator, you get 6.75. So that's, now we know that that is what's in the middle. Okay. And you're not always going to have nice numbers. You're just going to have to estimate them on the graph. Okay. So after you get all the data, you get your x's and y's, you just got to plot your points. So -3 is at 0. -2 is at +6. -1.5. So I'm going to go -1. I'm going to go halfway up. And then 6.75 is almost to 7. So I'm just going to go right there. And then -1's at 6, and then you're at 0, 0. So then I'm going to connect them, and I'm actually not surprised at all that it's upside down, because remember, your a value, if it's positive, it's facing up, and if it's negative, it's concave down. So it is facing down, which is exactly what happened. All right, after you graph it, the last thing you have to do is just state your answers. So where does it cross the x-axis? What are the solutions? There and there. Again, you can see it from your table. Those are the answers. Okay, so one of my answers is -3, 0, and the other answer is 0, 0. Okay, if it happens to ask you what the y-intercept is, the y-intercept is also 0, 0, because that's where it crosses the y-axis. Okay, let's do one more. X squared minus 5x plus 8. Again, I need to find the vertex, so opposite of b over 2a. So I'm going to take 5 divided by 2 times 1. If there's nothing in front, remember it's assumed to be 1. So then 5 divided by 2 is 2.5. So then I'm going to put that on my table. If I put 2.5 in the middle, it's in between 2 and 3. And then I have a 1 and a 4. Okay. Then if I have my graphing calculator, I'm going to hit the y equals button. I'm going to type in x squared minus 5x plus 8. And then I'm going to hit second graph to look at the table, or I'm doing it the long way. Okay. Either way, you are going to end up with this table. Once again, know that you're missing the middle. So you're missing the 2.5. So you have the 4 and the 4 matches and the 2 and the 2 matches, but you're missing 2.5. So again, you have to do this one by hand. Okay, so anywhere that you see an x, you have to plug it in. So I'm going to put a 2.5 next to that -5, and I'm going to square a 2.5. So just be careful how you type it in. Okay, so on your home screen or on your calculator, you're going to type in parentheses 2.5 squared minus 5 times 2.5 and then plus 8. And you should end up with 1.75. 1.75. So now you have the rest of your table. From here, you can just plot your points. So we have a point at 1 and 4, which is up here. We have a point at 2 and 2, which is right here. 2.5, so right in the middle, is at 1.75. Sorry, that last point I did not plot right, is at 2. 1, 2, there we go. And then 2.5 and 1.75 is like pretty much almost to 2. There. And then 3 and 2 and 4 and 4. And here is my quadratic. Okay, so a couple of things. Number one, it's asking for the x-intercepts. And if you can see in the table, but more importantly, if you see in the graph, there are none. Okay, there are no solutions to this. Okay, there is no answer where it comes down here and crosses the x-axis. Okay, so sometimes that happens. My graph is concave up, and this 1.75 is the lowest point that it goes. It's never going to have a y value of 0, and that might happen. Okay, so it could look like that. Another thing that could happen is it could be facing upside down, but be like this, and so it also is never going to cross. Okay, so there are no answers. There's no solutions. There is a y-intercept, though. Every quadratic has a y-intercept. We just don't see it. Okay, and we can't assume. So in order to find the y-intercept, that's when you plug in x being 0. Okay, so if I plug in 0, then what happens? I'm going to go back to the top. 0 squared, that actually becomes gone. -5 times 0, well, that's just going to be 0. And so I'm left with 8. So what I want you to know is the y-intercept in this case is actually always your c value. Okay, when it's in standard form. So in this case, my answer for the y-intercept is 0, 8. It's always c. Okay, but sometimes you might not have an x-intercept, but you always have a y-intercept. Like look back to this one, there was no c, so this y-intercept was 0. And in this one, c was -6, and the y-intercept turned out to be -6. So that's not a coincidence. Okay. So last thing, let's wrap this up. How many solutions are possible? So when you have a quadratic and you're solving, like just when you factor, you do the quadratic formula, a lot of times you're going to get 2 answers. Almost every single problem is going to give you 2 answers. Okay. What might happen though is you might actually get 1 answer, and that happens when your vertex happens to be your solution. Okay. And then the last possible thing that could happen is you just don't get any answers because it never is going to cross the x-axis. Okay, and so that is how you solve quadratics by graphing. Good luck, and let me know if you need anything.